Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the first celebration for this week's celebrating women in architecture and celebrating International Women's Day today. If any of you guys haven't joined us before, we're the Birmingham Architectural Association. We're a REBA branch in Birmingham and a small committee that focuses on loads of different activities and have different interests. So if you ever want to get involved or have an event that you want done or any research that you think needs looking into, then do just email us at baa@bromarchitecture.com. The event today is done in conjunction with REBA West Midlands. So they're kind of like the branch masters of all the branches. And that's with Rachel, who you'll see. But generally, none of this would be possible without our sponsors. So thank you very much to Alamere, All Good, Outro, Ibstock Bricks, Kitchen Gallery, Milliken, Rayners, and Taylor Maxwell. Before I introduce you to Danny and Sarika, who have helped coordinate this whole series, just wanted to give you a short overview in terms of what's happening this week. This whole week we'll be showcasing our exhibition online, and Sarika is going to talk to you a bit more about that. On Monday, which is tonight, we'll be hearing from 4 fantastic speakers about different stages in their careers. And also on Tuesday, so tomorrow, it's going to be a bit more of a coffee and cake kind of situation where we're just talking with different parents. So if you're a parent, come along, and it won't be all kind of sadness or like how to deal with kids during lockdown. Obviously they're back at school now, but it's also talking about like positive things that you can do, and also like if you're pregnant during lockdown in this period, how different ways to help each other, and also if you're a sort of a father in this period as well, and you're in architecture, and how that might affect you. And then on Wednesday, we've got an employment law workshop, which won't be recorded, neither will the Parenthood in Architecture one. And that will be just kind of big questions in terms of, being furloughed, or if you're going on parental leave, and just understanding your rights. And then on Thursday, we've got like a great talk with interior designers, Cream and Black. They've just opened their own sort of studio in Birmingham, and they've opened their own shop on Harborne High Street. And it's looking at the parallels between how women and how the interior design is kind of almost entirely female led, and that contrasting with architecture should be a really exciting sort of debate and workshop. And last of all, on Friday, we've got a laughing yoga session with Mary Maggie, so that's just for fun, and also that's it. But I'll hand you over to Danny to tell you more about tonight's event.
Thanks, Marina. So this is our annual event marking International Women's Day by celebrating women in architecture in the West Midlands. So why do we do this event? It can be a really difficult discussion as to why we differentiate women in the profession, but the fact remains that architecture is still an unequal industry. There have been massive strides in terms of more women undertaking architectural training and entering the profession, but there remains a huge issue with women within the upper echelons of management, essentially in all decision-making roles. This year has been especially challenging for the profession with the effects of the pandemic. It's been felt across the board. And unfortunately, the evidence shows that women have been disproportionately affected. This adds a different dimension to our International Day, Women's Day celebrations this year. It makes it more important that we celebrate the achievements of women in the field, working under such difficult circumstances and still somehow managing to smash it. Events like this really highlight the importance of representation in the design of the built environment in creating inclusive and successful spaces. The amount of times that you can attend meetings still and be the only woman in the room, and touching upon the intersectional aspects of the issue. Further to that, the amount of times when there may be no representation from any of the BAME communities, for example, at all. It's quite shocking. In saying that, there's no way diminishing the expertise of the men in the room. However, in that scenario, when you have a group of very similar people, the collective lived experience will only cover a really limited range of understanding, which normally will cater to a very specific group of already privileged people. So to put another way, design decisions are being made for a diverse society by one very small section of already advantaged people. So that's why having representation of different groups is absolutely critical in the design world in order to design for all. But to do that, you need to have a seat at the table. So women make up 50% of the population. We don't have 50% of seats at the table. So this is what events like this attempt to address. So to give credit where it's due and to support and uplift the amazing women working in the profession. We've had some amazing speakers over the few years that we've been running this event with really inspirational stories of their professional journeys and experiences. Last year, we had an incredible guest, Mary de Saules. She was really engaging, a real pioneer in the industry, and to hear about her experience in the profession and how much it had changed over the years, it was really eye-opening. She really helped pave the way for people like us to thrive in the industry. As many of you may be aware, Mary sadly passed away earlier in the year, so we feel really privileged to have been able to hear her story. This event is dedicated to her to say a massive thank you. The BAA will be doing a tribute to her, and we're currently in discussions with her family and with the Shrewsbury Civic Society, which was an organisation that was really close to her heart, to celebrate her life. So to start with, I'd like to raise a glass, if we can, to anyone that's got one, and just say a toast to Mary. Before we introduce the other speakers, I'll pass you over to Sarika, who'll talk about the exhibition to showcase the West Midlands talent this year.
Thank you, Danny. So those of you that attend our event every year will know that we usually hold an exhibition for our guests to view the local talent within the Midlands. And this year we didn't want this to be forgotten. So we've turned this event and exhibition into a virtual exhibition this year, and it will be on our BAA website all month long. So please do have a look at your own leisure. We'll be adding to this exhibition as well as the month goes on. And it's just a celebration of all the local women in the West Midlands who've contributed to the built environment, from students to architectural designers, architects and directors. So they've also chosen a key project in the Midlands that they want to celebrate and talk about. And they've also offered a bit of a biography about themselves so we can get to know the women behind the built environment in the West Midlands. So moving to tonight's events, we have a fantastic lineup of panelists, as we've mentioned, who share their experience with us all. So our first speaker is incredibly accomplished woman, an architect, business owner and published author, Samita Singh. So over to you, Samita.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sarika. So as a woman growing up in poverty in India and an immigrant to the UK, my route into architecture has been difficult. As my paths have been blocked, I've found different ways of doing architecture, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I've been doing architecture through work, through designing, writing, and advocacy. So I've got a slideshow for you. If we just have the first one, please. So my family of 5, that is my parents and 3 sisters, lived in one room with a leaking roof in a busy commercial area of New Delhi. At one point, I even slept on the table that was also used for my studies and for eating on. My father was a renowned maths teacher who believed in the power of education, so he enrolled his daughters in the best school in the area, which needed fees. My father cycled to work in all weathers and taught poor students in a government school, so his pay wasn't very much. So my mother was the wonder economist of the family who managed to make it all work, buying from the government-run Russian shops and pavement vegetable stalls. I managed to get scholarships through school and universities and worked at various jobs from the age of 17 to help with household expenses. My reading and painting supplies were replenished annually by winning competitions for which my parents enthusiastically ferried us on buses or on foot. Our clothes were either home-stitched from scraps of materials my mother bought or bought secondhand. Next slide, please. After graduating from the Delhi School of Architecture with a gold medal, my design thesis also won an international award. Here on the left, you see my design thesis. I received the UK's Overseas Development Association Student Scholarship and elected to study the Masters in the newly established course on environmental design at Cambridge University, and in the process became the first woman to do so. So here you see my work as a student, and then you see me working on site before I joined Cambridge. My identity as an Indian woman has been important to me. I became the first and the only woman to wear a sari at graduation in Cambridge. Next slide, please. 30 years ago, people used to ask me, so what exactly did you study at Cambridge? But now environmental concerns are very much in the limelight. I started my design practice, Ecologic, in 1993 after being made redundant in the recession. Here you see some of my design work, which has involved sustainability and community engagement. I also started teaching sustainable design then, and have taught at many universities in the UK and abroad. I've been a member of several RIBA committees and was elected to the council. Presently, I sit on the RIBA Professional Standards Panel. Next slide, please. Besides my architectural work, I've also set up an environmental design charity, Charushila. Charushila has worked on community projects in places of conflict and scarce resources. Here you see some of the work we've undertaken in the UK and abroad. I'm a trustee of the Architects Benevolent Society, Commonwealth Association of Architects, and Waltham Abbey Royal Gunpowder Mills. After noticing that Asian architecture students had the worst rate of attrition, I co-founded the Asian Architects Association last year, and you can find us on all the social media. Next slide, please. Since we are here on the International Women's Day, I'd like to tell you about women in architecture. The Women Architects Group was established in the late 1970s as an offshoot of the Salaried Architects Group. I joined the Women Architects Group in 1996 and became the chair in 1999. And on the left, you see one of the articles that was published in Building Design when my son was a tiny baby. And I think that was the first time this Building Design had published the picture of a baby, I was told. After a couple of months, it was announced that this group was to become part of the RIBA's special interest group. My response, and I wrote then, that being a woman wasn't a special interest. I responded by changing the name of the group to Women in Architecture instead of WAG, which included all women architects, teachers, and students. The group also became independent of the RIBA and more focused on practical issues such as work and education. After chairing Women in Architecture, I established Architects for Change, the Equality Forum at the RIBA. I received the Atkins Inspire for Diversity and Women in Business Awards for my work in promoting diversity in architecture. During my time as chair of Women in Architecture, there's the certificate you see on the right. So during my time as chair of Women in Architecture, there were 8% women architects. At present, there are 28% women architects, 20% of whom are members of the RIBA. And you have to remember that in 1970, there were 4% women architects. So between 1970, we've reached 28% women architects. The average rate of increase has been 1% each year since the time I was chair, while the universities have been taking an average of 40 to 50% women architects of architecture for a number of years. The rate of attrition has been disappointing. One of the conclusions of the 2000 report, Why Women Leave Architecture, was the lack of childcare provision, lack of progression, poor pay, along with systemic discrimination were major factors in women leaving architecture. Even today, we do not see many women in the boards of large practices. In 1996, the gender pay gap was 25%. Today, women architects earn an average of 10 to 20% less than men. So it means that gender pay gap hasn't decreased that much since then. But we are here now with the technology to work from home, but not the equality to work from home. During this lockdown, women have been impacted unfairly. More homeschooling was done by mothers than fathers, 67% of women compared to 52% of men. Studies also showed that mothers were 23% more likely than fathers to have temporarily or permanently lost their jobs during the crisis. Women were 14% more likely to have been furloughed. Where you live also seems to have impacted disproportionately. There are two Englands, it would seem, South and North England. Next slide, please. There were additional issues as well that made lockdown difficult for those who were single parents, those suffering domestic abuse, and those without spaces for home working, along with computers, suitable furniture, and secure internet. Women from minority ethnic and deprived backgrounds have suffered more in lockdown. Even having a non-European name like mine has consequences. As Toni Morrison said, racism and sexism mean that you have to constantly explain yourself, even your existence. And constantly, everything is a constant battle. It's not been easy by any means, but I've developed a certain sense of humor and determination at the obstacles presented to me. So this slide, you can read some of the comments I've received in the last 25 years. So some of these come from RIBA, which is quite shocking, and then some of them came from outside the RIBA. Next slide, please. I've tried to make best use of all that life has thrown at me. I've continuously written about things I've been involved in practice. So this slide shows some of my practice-based research, which have now been published as books. As architects, we have to be eternal optimists and activists. My passion for healthcare design, which are the last two books, was ignited after time spent in hospitals following 5 miscarriages and a stroke from a clotting disorder that I suffer from. I've also suffered from heart failure. 4 years later, I became a non-executive director of Moorfields Eye Hospital NHS Foundation Trust in 2013. And I have been involved in promoting BAME leadership in the NHS, and obviously been very closely involved with the COVID pandemic. I co-founded the CCALL group, which supports leadership from minority ethnic backgrounds. Part of making change is noticing what is happening and then taking action, seeing what the world needs and seeing what you have to offer. That kind of matchmaking always works. Choices are important. I've taken difficult paths and made unconventional choices. My mother told me that if I should ever find myself in a position of privilege, I should strive to help others. I will continue to do so. Thank you for listening to me.
Well, thank you for that, Smita. That was really insightful and a lot of big shoes to fill. But I just wanted to say to everyone that's listening, if you do have any questions that are specifically to Smita, do put them in the chat on the Q&A. We've only got about 10 minutes at the end, so we were just going to have one general question to all the speakers. But if there's one specific one as they're speaking, do feel like you can ask the question, and if we have time, we'll answer them. But that was great. Thank you very much, Smita, for joining us. I'll just put you through to Anne Neverwood's going to be speaking next. So I'm just going to mute myself, and good luck, Anne. Any questions, let us know.
My story starts in Liverpool in 1966 when I graduated, and this is one of the streets in Liverpool at the time. Lovely Georgian houses which were very run down because there was planning blight, and the planners were going to kind of demolish them, so there was no reason to keep them nice. And I worked in my spare time with my husband for what it was a precursor really of modern housing associations to try and develop these houses, change them into very affordable flats for people who didn't have housing. It was the time when there was a film called Cathy Come Home, which was all about how people could easily lose their housing and become homeless. So that's what we were working on then. And when we did our renovations, we did try and keep as much of the fabric as possible. Those were my two passions, really. Have been my two passions all the way through my career, which was historic buildings, conservation, and affordable housing. And I'm not really going to talk too much about the conservation bit. I've got some stuff on the exhibition about that. But the first job that we ever did as a practice, Robert and Anne Netherwood, was refurbishing this mine supervisor's house in Yorkshire. And the one I've done fairly recently has been tower repairs to a Grade 1 listed church, putting a rotten timber structure and into a bit more sustainable future. So what I want to talk about today really is about what we did in the 70s and early 80s in Tanzania, because I think that what we did then has got something to say about affordable housing and how we might consider it. This is part of the master plan for Dodoma. They were moving the capital from Dar es Salaam on the coast to the centre of Tanzania. And we were asked to go and set up and run a home advisory service for people who wanted to build their own housing in the capital. And we were seconded from the Church Mission Society to the Capital Development Authority. So that's how we got there. And the first thing we did to look at what people could afford was look at what people were already doing. And this is a typical village house, tembe, made of mud brick. We'd call it cob, I suppose. And it was very sustainable, very integrated into the environment. But when people went into the towns, they built houses like this if they had right to be there. And this would be a concrete block, 1 to 11 sand cement mix, which made it fairly crumbly, and a tin roof, which was quite hot when the sun shone. If you didn't have the right to be there, even if you were on a reasonable income, you lived in a house like this, because there's no point in actually paying money for your house if you haven't got the right to be there, because it might get demolished any time. So we looked at what people could afford, and the first thing that I did was to go trawl through annuity stuff to try and find out what people could afford, what their income was, what sort of house they could afford. And there were 3 basic rules that we went by. The United Nations had published a book called Housing in Africa, which said that housing shouldn't cost more than 3 times your annual income, possibly 3.5. So we went by that and tried to make our housing in that bracket. And the key thing in Tanzania was that we could only do what we did do because there was no land speculation. You didn't own land, you had the right to be there, you had the right of occupancy. And that was key, because it meant that there was no kind of escalating cost of land. So what we did was design houses which would be able to be expanded in the future. And that was really fairly straightforward. So you start with a small bit, you add on a wing, you add on another wing, and then eventually you have a courtyard house like that. And we built some, well, we didn't do it, but the Capital Development Authority built some prototypes because they wanted them to look nice. And we said, look, this is not sustainable. The tiles were made by an Italian firm, and they couldn't make them at volume, and they couldn't make them at speed, and actually they leaked. So we had to put corrugated iron underneath anyway. So we started looking at how you could build sustainably in that situation. And so we looked at walls. This chap was building his own house and he was firing his own bricks. And we thought, well, that's not sustainable for the whole of the capital, but actually, if there's clay, we can use Simvarams and make a bit of a more solid block. So we got some Simvarams and hired them out, Building Materials Centre. Then we looked at roofs, and this is sisal cement. Sisal was a big Tanzanian product, but the bottom had dropped out of the market because everybody was using nylon rope. And so it was very cheap and we could easily get the sisal. And so you lay it up, it's a bit like fiberglass, lay it up on cement, and it's formed over corrugated iron into roof sheets, about 1 metre square. So that was good, and people could put it onto the corrugated iron because it fitted if they wanted to put that on underneath. It was straightforward, very easily produced and quite cheap. And then it's an earthquake area in central Tanzania, but the sand cement construction was not earthquake proof. The traditional tembes were because of the timber structure, but once you've got a very thin sand cement, it's not earthquake resistant at all. And so we had some volunteers, year out students coming to help, and this is one of them with some of the local people as well, and they made a former. We couldn't get timber. You couldn't get timber because there wasn't any in that part of the world. So they made a sisal cement former for a ring beam, and you just put a rod in it and stuck it through full of cement, concrete, and that made a ring beam around the top of the house, which stopped the walls going outwards when there was an earthquake. And this is the ring beam going on one of the houses. And then we redesigned a whole area. This was planned by the master planners, but when you actually looked at what was there, the roads were going to go through people's houses, and that was a bit of a stupid thing to do, really. And we had very fortuitously, we had the help from a United Nations traffic road designer, traffic engineer, who was at a loose end because he couldn't do what he was supposed to be doing. So he came and helped us, which was brilliant because we redesigned all the roads to avoid the houses. And I think we only had to demolish actually one house in the end. And then everybody was given the right to be on the plot that they were. And they were there anyway. It was a village, and it just so happened that the capital was kind of overtaking them. The surveyors went mad because all the lines were sort of at a wonky, but they did it. And the interesting thing was that when the World Bank pulled the plug on loans and the national housing ground to a halt, the local authority developed housing ground to a halt because there wasn't any funding, this area just went on going, and within 18 months of people being given the right to be there, 80% of them had actually improved their houses, put permanent houses up. So that was my experience, and that was a long time ago. I mean, it was 40 years ago, but I think there are parallels to what's happening in the UK at the moment. And this is the challenge I want people to think about, really. Housing costs in the UK, I looked this up on the internet. The average family income, 30,000. The average cost of house purchase is 250,000, and that is over 8 times the annual income, which is not good. So that's why there's a housing problem. But if you look at the build costs, it's actually much better. There's the number crunching for that. And that gives you something like 60 square meters, which isn't far off what an average house size in the UK is at the moment, 76 meters, which would cost about 4.5 times your average annual income. And interestingly, that's what most mortgage lenders will lend people. So where is the difference between 4.5 times and 8? Well, of course, it is the cost of land, because in England and the UK generally, land is seen as a commodity. It's not, it's something that you buy and sell, something that you can invest in, you can hang on to it, wait till the price goes up, and if you get planning permission, of course, the price rockets. So if you're looking at housing finance for the UK in 2020, not more than 3 times, or say 4.5 times the annual income, we haven't got the red bit. We haven't got the land question right. And that's a challenge, I think, for all of us, that if we all got together and perhaps thought about how we might deal with that, there might be a change, there might be a sea change, but it'll take more than just one person. So I'm not going to do it on my own, but I wouldn't mind joining a group that looked into this. And then finally, design for future expansion, because I think most architectural firms turn their noses up at small scale extensions, and actually they make a huge difference. This is a very small 2-bedroom terrace house in a conservation area in London, and this is the extension that I did with an architectural assistant. And it was finished, I think, eventually last year, and the owner sent me these photographs. Very pleased with it. It was quite difficult because there were things like, well, partly it was in a conservation area. That didn't actually cause any problems. They went straight through, but things like party wall and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, they were pleased with it. And at the end, they sent me an email which said this: so you can make a difference, and so don't turn your nose up at doing small scale extensions, because actually that is part of solving the housing crisis, I think, giving people expandable housing. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Anne. You, for people who don't know, Anne only set up her practice sort of, was it in 2016?
Yes.
After being, was it a vicar for?
Yeah, I was a vicar for 16 years, and my husband carried on with the Robert and Anne Netherwood practice when we came back from Tanzania. I was working for him to start off with, and then I was a vicar for 16 years. And then when he was ill, I went back to architecture to give him a hand. And when he died, I carried on doing architecture. So that's how I got back into it. I had to do quite a lot of CPD to get back. Yeah.
That's amazing, kind of, yeah, the story that you've kind of gone back to, and that you're so passionate about, especially kind of the housing crisis that we're in. So hopefully if people have any questions, they'll pop them into the chat and we'll let you know at the end. But thank you very much for taking the time, and it all worked with the tech in the end. So well done. I'll just head over to Libby, who's she'll kind of talk you through just at the start of starting her own practice. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it off.
Okay, if everyone can hear me, we'll try and expand this so we can do full screen. Where am I missing this now? Full screen. So yeah, as Marina said, sort of at the start of my own practice, people don't know me, I'm Libby, and I specialise in historic buildings as well as Sam. And so I started my own practice in April 2020, start of COVID basically, and I'll talk a bit about that later. I'm on the committee of the Birmingham Architecture Association and of the West Midlands Architecture Conservation Group. And I'm also a SPAB scholar, the Society Protection of Ancient Buildings. So a bit about that was just sort of that. So a bit about where I started. So I studied at Cardiff University, and it was very early on I realised that my heart was not in big developments or hospitals or expansion. For me, it was all about the vernacular and the small buildings. I'd grown up in a really small village in Buckinghamshire in the Chiltern Hills, and everything around me was sort of at that scale, and that was what I was used to. So early on I realised that my career was going to be quite different to some of my friends, and I wasn't going to work in sort of the big London practices. And in second year, I spent some time in Africa on a humanitarian build project. And out there, I got in touch. We were working with the materials a lot. And it made me realise that for me, it was all about being on site, understanding the materials and working with them and how they work, and the people on site doing it as well. So my career was always going to be as hands-on as possible. And then in my first year, I went on a placement to a practice in Marlow, in Buckinghamshire again, in the Chiltern Hills. And that's where I was really introduced to what a listed building was and what historic buildings were and the difference between them. And I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate. My boss unfortunately lost both of his parents, and I was the only person in the practice who knew the projects. So from a part one, I was running projects on site and working as contract admin. So for me, that put me in quite a different position, but allowed me to be on site more because that was my role in the practice. I then went back and studied my master's, and my tutor was Kate Darby. For those of you who know or don't know Kate, she won AJ Small Projects a few years ago with a barn that was basically falling down, and she sort of housed it in a corrugated metal. And it was amazing when you went in it, the ivy was still growing in this building, yet she was using it as her studio. And I think that really grasped me of what is conservation, how can we protect historic buildings? So once I finished my master's, I decided conservation was where I wanted to be, and it's working with historic buildings. So I worked for a firm called Donald Insall Associates, who is probably one of the largest practices who work on historic buildings and do conservation. And this was I very much started at the bottom, working out conservation philosophy, understanding historic buildings, how they work differently to modern buildings of today, understanding sort of churches and the different policy around that compared to a lot of standard buildings. And I started understanding my own philosophy and how I felt about historic buildings and how they should be treated. And I think one of my sort of highlight projects was Moseley Road Baths in Birmingham. So it's an Edwardian swoon bath built in 1907. And as a highlight project, so I was project architect for this for 2 years. And we did the conservation and repair project to the Gala Pool, which you see in the far left image. And this was quite strange for me because I've been learning about historic buildings and this was concrete. So just been learning about lime, and then I had to work with concrete again. So this, again, I started going on more CPDs and understanding more about how historic buildings work and how I would like to approach these buildings and my own stamp on it. And I discovered the SPAB. So I went on some of their courses, their working parties, and I really became engaged in understanding who I wanted to be and what I wanted to learn. Going back to sort of my experience in Africa and what I'd set out from the beginning, I wanted to be on site, I wanted to be hands-on and understand the materials. So I was awarded the SPAB scholarship. And actually, I think one thing really interesting here is that I was awarded it along with 2 other girls, Amy and Lucy. One's an engineer and the other's an architect. And this is the first year ever that it's been 3 female scholars. And I think that's really interesting because this has been running since before the war. And this is the first year it's been all 3 females. They've had plenty of years of all 3 males. So I think that's really sort of a step in the right direction for the industry. However, a week before I was meant to do this scholarship, it was cancelled due to COVID. So we've done it, this is just the 3 of us, we've done a few trips this year, and the scholarship is due to run this year, so I will be going on it. And it will be 9 months of spending time on site, meeting craftsmen and understanding the materials. And for me to move forward in the career how I would like to move forward, this is really important. This will take me from being an architect who sort of specifies things and then doesn't fully understand, to actually being able to work with the craftsmen to understand, okay, well, that works better in this way and we can do it like this. And for me, that's where I want to be, sort of half on site all the time, working with them. So yes, as I said, COVID happened. And at this point, I had quit my job with Insall's, left on good terms, but it was at a point where I was ready to move forward. and I had rented out my house. So I was sort of homeless and jobless. And this was sort of one of the lowest points, I think, for me. Someone who had sort of been in control of where they were going all the time. So what did I do? I decided to start my own practice, Liberty Rose Architects. And it started really because on the side, I had sort of always done a few projects, running along, just small things for friends and family. And then I was asked by a family friend to look at a building, 17th century listed building, and he wanted to convert it. It was originally 6, then he wanted to convert it. It'd be made into 1, and he wanted to convert it back into 3 with an extension. And I thought, well, I'll just set up a practice and see how things go. And it's been amazing. Like, I haven't really advertised, but I think word of mouth and the amount of work that's just been coming through has been amazing. And it's all on historic buildings, which is what I'm really interested in. So I just thought I'd give you an example of kind of things that I work on and what, as an architect specialising in historic buildings, what I do. So the building in the top left is a Lutchins building in Surrey. And my role here is I just sort of do a condition survey. We carry out repairs. They've got a cottage in the grounds, which we did a refurbishment project for. Then the building below that, sort of cottage in the fog, that is an 18th century, where it was 3 houses, and now it's just 1 large house, and the roof has lots of holes. So that's a re-roofing project. The house centrally is sort of an early Victorian house. It looks quite Georgian in its styling, but date-wise it's early Victorian. And the idea here is we're doing a small extension because the kitchens are actually sort of below ground, well, half below ground. So they want a better connection between their kitchen and garden. The one on the far right is 17th century. It's been refaced in the 19th century in a really poor condition, not lived in for 10 years. And that was the one I was talking to you about, extending and repairing. And we're doing a small extension to the one on the bottom right. So all of these buildings in these photos are listed buildings. Some of them grade 2, some of them grade 2 star. And my role as an architect isn't always design. Sometimes it's repair, but what it is working with historic buildings, I think, is the challenge. It's always a puzzle on how to resolve something. And for me, that's what I really enjoy doing and feel really lucky to have found my role. So I just thought I'd talk about a bit about being a woman and being in the architectural industry. Personally, I've actually found it a very positive experience. And I think I'm quite a confident person and go in on site, and it could be daunting, you know. Most of the contractors especially are male. And I think for me, one of the more daunting things is my age. You're going on site with a lot of experienced males. And I think the first impression they will always have of you is, do they know what they're doing? Does she know what she's doing? And so for me, the challenge is changing that perception, not just of me, but of other women and other people in the industry. I'm always make sure that I go and speak to all the labourers. Doesn't matter if it's just a boy sweeping up the floor or whether it's a stonemason, go and have a conversation with the people on site. And I think it's really important that the impression they get of a woman on the building site is that I'm willing to get involved and understand what they're doing and want to be part of this project. We're working together as a team. And I really think it's important to try and change that perception of, and for it to be the normal for a woman to come on site, whether they're a professional, whether they're a contractor themselves. And I think one thing that's really was amazing throughout my time at Insuls is there's an architect in Historic England who's a conservation architect, and she was sort of my mentor through my time at Insuls and growing. And she was such a confident and powerful woman. And, you know, when you're going alongside, she would just say whatever she thought. And I think for me, that brings your confidence. And as a woman, you should never be scared to say something because of the way that it may be interpreted by a male or someone more experienced than you. And I just think it's really positive that this year the scholarship has had the 3 women, and hopefully that's sort of a sign that things in the industry are improving. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Libby. Definitely last year probably wasn't what you're expecting the year to be, like many of us, but it's great to see that you're thriving, and the advice that you gave was very helpful. And I do agree. Speaking to people on site makes a huge difference. So I'll hand you guys over to the last speaker, which is Tegan. Good luck, Tegan.
Thank you. Hiya. Let me just share my screen. Can you see that? All good. Yes, so I'm Tegan. I'm currently doing my master's at Birmingham City Uni, and I've recently become student ambassador for the BAA. And then since my return to university, I founded the Birmingham Architecture and Design Women's Network, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So yeah, this is me. I actually attended this event last year, back when we were all allowed to be in the same room. And I came looking for like some inspiration and some guidance. And I was amazed by like all the women who spoke that evening. And I heard so many wonderful stories of what these women had achieved in practice. Unfortunately, at that time, I was struggling with my practice placement for a number of reasons. And these have begun to negatively affect my mental health. And I felt like I'd been overlooked in comparison to my male colleagues of like a similar level. And just to like summarize these quickly without dwelling on the past too much. So I narrowed it down to, these 3 things. There were no female architectural senior staff who I could look up to a mentor, which was something Libby said she had. And I'm actually really jealous that that was something she got to experience in practice, because I think it's so important when you first begin your career. And then this leads to my second point of like a lack of direction. And I knew from pretty early on that I wanted to progress into management, whether it was that particular practice I was working for or of my own eventually. And throughout my 3 years that I was there for, I was lucky that I got to experience like a range of RIBA stages, which I know isn't always the case. The longer I spent there, the more I felt I was constantly battling for the right to learn more or to be challenged and be given more responsibility, which I know is pretty common for part 1s who kind of get pigeonholed into CAD surveys and plan applications. So this, like alongside several other like microaggressions in the workplace, led me on a search for a support network of women. I knew that I needed advice and guidance on like how to handle this situation, but I actually couldn't find what I was looking for. There's obviously like the women in architecture, but that's like a lot of women who are in established practices, and it's a bit intimidating as a part 1 to feel you could talk to them. So I considered leaving to find another job, but then I had concerns about what if another practice was exactly the same. I considered leaving the profession altogether and taking alternative routes into interiors or set design. I even took a little project management qualification just in case I wanted to go that way. And basically I just felt very isolated. I wasn't in the city centre itself, so struggled to attend like networking events, which is why the Women in Architecture event last year was such a significant part of this journey for me. Then COVID hit, as we all say. I no longer had to spend every day in an office I wasn't happy in. I got put on furlough like so many other people did, and was eventually made redundant. And this coincided with my decision to return to university for my master's anyway, because I knew I had so much still to learn and so many more projects to explore. And I can honestly say I'm currently at my healthiest mentally than I have been for quite a while. So early on in the academic year, we had a seminar about like feminist theory in architecture, and this led to discussions with some peers about the need for a safe space to talk about this and the need for like a support network. So the Birmingham Architecture and Design Women's Network, or the BAD Women's Network for short, was born. And it's made up of like a combination of undergraduates, postgrads, and some alumni from architecture, interiors, and product design. And we've had so much support from the staff of the school, and the BAA have been like so supportive of me, which has been great. Our committee is currently myself as chair, Charlotte, who is an architecture alumni, as secretary, Emma from product design as treasurer, Michelle, who is on masters with me, as our media and communications, and Ananya, who's undergraduate architecture, as our inclusion and diversity officer. And if you want to know any more about these wonderful women that I get to work with, then there's like a meet the committee section on our Instagram page. So as a network, we've set ourselves some like aims that we want to achieve, and that's to offer support, to educate, and to celebrate. So to offer support, we frequently catch up with other women within the school and alumni over like video calls, which during COVID has provided like a connection across disciplines and year groups in the university. I formed friendships that wouldn't have existed otherwise. We provide a safe space to share our struggles in education, employment, or just in everyday life. And we do want to extend this support to anyone who's listening today, anyone who just needs a chat or a vent. Just feel free to send me a message on Instagram or something. And then we want to educate everyone on how to be an ally. How can men and women be an ally? How to teach them how to like spot discrimination in their workplace and stand up for it, because a lot of like my male peers didn't even notice these things were happening until I said, well, did this not happen in your workplace? And they would then remember that it's not always equal. So I think it's actually a big thing for them to learn to spot it. And then something especially for myself as a white woman is educating on how we can be an ally for the BAME community and stand up against racial discrimination. And then finally, we want to celebrate the achievements, the hard work, the struggles we've overcome. We want to showcase the amazing work of our female and non-binary students and alumni, not because we need to prove they're as good as their male counterpart, because we already know they are, but because once in a while it's important to look back and see how far we've come. Our aims as a network will continue to grow as we progress, and as we gain more input from other women with different stories and journeys to ours. We will always be here to offer support and a lending hand to anyone who might be struggling, similar to how I was. We might not always have a solution, but there's quite a lot of comfort knowing that you're not the only one struggling. So thank you for listening, and thank you to the BAA for inviting me to speak with all these inspiring women today.
Wow, thank you very much, Tegan. That was incredible. I don't know what you were nervous about. It was really interesting to learn about the BAD network and how you managed to kind of form that and had the long-term vision, as well as kind of really clear goals that you want to achieve. So that kind of concludes all our speakers tonight, and we've got numerous questions. So if people are happy to hang around for the next 15 minutes, I'm gonna ask like one key question, because as you've heard, there's 4 exceptionally talented speakers with us today. You, Anne, Smita, Tegan, and Libby, and we've got some questions here that are kind of more directed. So I think there's one for you, Anne, which was, would you, or anyone else who feels like they can offer, would you recommend young architects to work abroad in more third world countries as part of their career?
Well, we certainly had a wonderful time. We certainly had a wonderful time doing it. I think it depends what you're doing, you know, and what the setup is. I think if you're working with the local people, yes, that's fine. I think if you just fly out and do stuff and then come back again, maybe not. I mean, that's my thought. Don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that.
Okay, that's perfect. And then one of the questions that we have for all of the panelists, because you're very passionate and you're kind of paving waves. I don't know whether it's intentional or just because there's something that you want to change about the world that you're in and improve. But if there's one piece of advice that you could give to someone that's either starting their own thing or whether they want to start a whole network like Tegan has or be part of that, or even if it's smaller things, so not necessarily starting their own practice, is there any advice that you would give people? So it's obviously a very difficult question, so I'll just go around and we'll start with Samita, if you're okay to answer that question.
So is it about young women starting their career?
Yeah.
Okay. It's Women's Day, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I had a very different experience because I came to this country and not knowing anybody. And my advice would for anyone starting their practice is actually get to know people, network. And your social skills are actually more important in getting jobs than your other skills, I found. And even when I went back to India, I noted that actually among my batchmates, the person who had actually got he'd really struggled in his studies, but he was very good at socializing. And he was doing amazing, huge jobs around in Delhi. So I think it's a very important quality to nurture, your social skills. And nobody teaches you how to network, but you have to learn, by doing it. So network, and Tegan's opened her Bad Women's Network. So go and join some more bad women, and you can network amongst yourselves and also learn a lot of little tricks.
Great, that's fantastic. Shall I pass you on to Anne next if you've got any kind of bits of advice?
Well, I'd say don't ever give up. There are things that make you want to give up, as Tegan was very, movingly saying. There are always going to be things that make you want to give up because it is unequal and it is difficult. I remember the first job I had, they said I couldn't go on site because there wasn't a ladies' loo, and so just don't give up. Don't let the so-and-sos get you down. Just keep going and take risks as well. Learn to take risks.
Fantastic. Libby, over to you.
Well, I'd definitely follow Anne and take risks. It's all about jumping in. No one's a professional until they've done it once. Like, just have a go. I think for me, my old boss would probably say I was a really bad employee. I never was doing what I was told. I was always doing whatever I wanted. Well, whatever I thought the client wanted. But I think one thing to really push is that be proactive. You're more valuable to the practice and they will want to push you more if you can prove your worth beyond just what your job is. So I was always looking at other funding routes and going towards churches and saying, look, we can go to this church and bring in work. And I think as a young architect, going out there and showing that you're enthusiastic beyond just your job really pushes you forward. And I would, I'd just be doing all sorts of different research, and I'd come being like, oh, I've just seen this job advertised on this website. I think we should have a go at it and try a competition. And I think that's what it's all about, is not just doing your 9 to 5. If you really love something, keep pushing it and show your work that you're pushing it.
On that note, someone's just said, do you have any advice for people doing long hours or overtime if it feels like it's kind of risk of kind of, obviously you've got should you be doing work outside of your work if it's something you're passionate about? But I'll lead it on to Tegan to answer the question. if you have any thoughts on that, Libby, just let us know. Tegan, is there anything that you would advise or tell anyone to start up their practice?
I mean, I don't know how to start with practice. I've not done that yet, but as for like, especially students, like this year alone, I've learned to just kind of say yes to every opportunity that is thrown at you, whether that be a student ambassador, set up a network, or just like do like volunteer work for practices. Just say yes to everything, and yeah, push your boundaries.
That's great. I think that's it from all the questions. So I just want to say a massive thank you to all our speakers today. It was exceptionally interesting. And as a BA8, this is the first time actually since it was made in 1874 that there's a female lead, and there's like our association itself is large, is sort of 50-50 male female. Obviously the women in architecture team that are bringing all the events this week, it's all volunteer, and so just want to say a big thank you to Danielle, Sarika, Rachel, Amy, Alison, who have made this possible, and Reba West Midlands for helping out. But last of all, but not least, thank you again to Samita and Tegan and Libby. There's probably questions coming in now. If there's any questions that you have that you want to ask each other, then that's fine. But otherwise, just want to say a massive thank you, and thank you to all our sponsors: Alamere, All Good, Outro, Ibstock Bricks, Kitchen Gallery, and Taylor Maxwell for helping to sponsor this event, making it all possible and completely free. There's been some kind of comments here, but generally they're all saying thank you for all the inspiring stories, and thank you for sharing your ambition, and yeah, thank you everyone. And there's one question which says, what are the bad aspirations for you, Tegan? But I guess those are your kind of free drivers, but is there something else?
No, I think it's just what was covered on there really.
And then if they want to get in contact with you, is the best thing to
Instagram's probably the easiest. It's literally at Bad Women's Network. We're tagged on all the BAA stuff anyway, so easy enough to find.
Great. I think that's it from me. Obviously join us, we've got a great set of events kind of coming up in the next couple of days with loads of different topics, so do have a look at the main Eventbrite. But thank you again for taking the time and preparing all those and such inspirational conversations and talks. So thank you very much.